Join in with our Women's Reserve Manager, Sian, celebrating International Women's Day today. Really just going to be a sit down with you, talking about your experiences as a woman managing and working in football, and especially the women's game. So let's start there. Fresh from returning from having a baby and stuff like that, and jumping straight back into women's football as you did so soon. How's reflect on that? How's that been over the past few months?
It's been tough. It's a massive shock to the system, adjusting to motherhood and then going back into football. But actually, it's a blessing in disguise because it's an evening and weekend job which works around my lifestyle, in terms of it's easy for me to get childcare during that time. So if I actually had a 9 to 5, probably would have been harder actually. So it's been quite a blessing in disguise that I'm back in football, where the hours are a little bit more weirdly unsociable hours, but it's worked for me anyway. Yeah, so it's been a good experience.
You must be the only person who's come into a game of football and said the hours are better for their life.
I know, right? But it actually is.
So looking at it, obviously women's football is very much like the men's, dominated by male coaches and stuff like that.
Yeah.
How difficult is it then being, a female manager in the game at the minute?
I think if you're in the women's game, it's still hard, don't get me wrong, because it's still male dominated. But if you're in the women's game is nicer to you as a woman and more encouraged. So if you're trying to get into the women's game, then they want more women and you feel like you belong there. If you're a female coach in the men's game, because I do men's football as well, that's when you better get the tough skin out, because that's the part of the game that it feels like they don't want you there. So you have to really knock down some walls and some barriers and overprove yourself to feel like you belong in the men's side.
And how difficult has that been to try and feel like you belong in men's football especially?
It's tough crowd. I would say. I think that you find yourself as if you can't make a mistake, because they're going to pick out any little thing that you can or you might not have said right, or you might have got wrong. So you find yourself having to almost be squeaky clean, and you're going to get called the physio a few times. They're going to think that you're a player's mum or a player's sister or a player's missus or something. You'll get referred to as every other job title before a coach, basically. So that bit is tough, that the first thing that somebody sees is not what you actually do and you want to do.
How positive then is it when you transition back into women's football to see that people see you as a manager rather than, a girlfriend or a physio or things like that?
It's refreshing. And I think that it's a sense of belonging, in the women's game, because you're not, as a woman in the women's game, you could be anyone. You could be any job. You could be the director, the manager, the physio, the club sec. You could be anyone in the women's game. Whereas I think in the men's game, they just believe that she could only have been this role or this role. So you do get a sense of home, I suppose, in the women's game, and a lot more. You don't have to earn your respect as much. It's just that you're respected. As a woman, you're respected. That's it.
So what lessons then can men's football take from the women's game?
I think sometimes men's football kind of need a woman's touch. Sometimes I think that I found that, and maybe this is just me personally, but I think that sometimes in the men's environment, there's a lot of testosterone in the room, and I think sometimes you need a woman to just bring it down a bit, calm it down a bit. And I'm not gonna meet fire for fire in the men's environment, so I'm not gonna square up to a 6'2" man if it's getting a bit heated. I'm 5'3". I'm gonna pick my battles. So you have to learn how to communicate with men and gain your respect from men, and I have no choice but to have a more of a gentler approach, because I'm not going to get into a physical with a guy that's twice my size and twice my width. It just doesn't make sense. So I think that if the men could get used to the change, that there are actually women that can talk sense and know football and know it how the men do. If they can kind of get past that barrier, then it should be a little bit more welcomed, I suppose, to have us in the game with them.
I suppose then as well is what does women's football need to do? Obviously, we've seen a massive growth in women's football since obviously the Euros win and before then. But what does women's football have to do to get in more female coaches and female managers at all levels of the game, really?
I think that's a layered one, to be honest. I think there's a lot of stuff that the women's game is missing from youth level. I think that even from when I was playing, I don't think I came across like a B licence or UEFA coach until I was probably like 20. So if you're playing from the age of like 11, that means that at youth level you're being coached by like someone's brother or someone's dad or a volunteer helping out that might just be doing their level 1 or has been in and around football but hasn't really like studied the game. So I think that the men have got that down to the T. Like you've got B licence, A licence coaches like coaching from like 8 years old. And you hear this like Coach Mbappe term, but you don't hear like, Coach Mbappe, Project Mbappe. You don't hear that in the women's game. You're not going to hear like Project Alex Scott. You just don't. It's just not a term that you're used. Maybe now it might be getting a bit better, but they don't get that level of coaching from such a young age. So then it takes a long time for female players to catch up. Yeah. So when you hear, like a boys under 18s team or an under 16 team can beat a women's team, let's say, that's because the level of coaching is so far behind from a youth level for girls. Yeah. So I think if you can get an elite standard of coaching into younger girls, it will then feed into the elite women's game. And there's things like, I think clubs have just got to risk it sometimes. At the end of the day, right now, if the men's side invest into the women's side, initially it's going to be a loss. But eventually, it's going to be a profit. So I think they've just got to risk it, just take the risk, just do it, because the clubs that have done it have benefited. So you just got to take the initial loss, maybe in the first year or so, before it kicks off. Yeah.
Okay. I suppose a different line of questioning is, if you look back now and if you were to give advice to kind of your younger self, coming out into adulthood and stuff like that, what advice would you give to them on their footballing journey? As
a coach or a player?
Well, both. There we go. Yeah, you've given yourself 2 questions to answer.
As a player, I would probably advise my younger self to just enjoy and take the pressure off, because I think I enjoyed up to a certain point, and then I think I got to like later teenage stage, like going into women's football, and then you suddenly start to get really heavy on yourself and hard on yourself. But now that I'm not playing anymore, you realise that actually you've probably got about 15 years of playing, and you'll have more time not playing than you won't. So you've got to try your best to like enjoy it and relax for as long as you can, because you never know when it's going to be taken away from you. If you get an injury and it stops early, then you're going to wish that you just enjoyed the years that you had. As a coach, my advice would probably be to I would say, this is tough because it's difficult, because there's a few lessons that I've learned on the way, and as a coach I'm still learning and I'm still growing. So I'd probably say from the beginning, trust yourself in terms of your knowledge, back yourself and execute your knowledge confidently, because people in the game are going to know if you're not confident in your knowledge, and you'll get found out very quickly if you don't. Take the time to study the game. So it sounds really simple, but watch a lot of football. Watch a lot of football. Just being on the grass and coaching sometimes isn't enough. You need to go and watch live games as well, not TV games. Go and watch live games, because I think TV games you've got a weird view almost, whereas live games is where you would see it from as a coach. You don't watch football games as a coach from in the heavens, do you? You watch it on the ground, so you have to get used to seeing and analysing the game from that view. And I think I would also say filter the advice that you get. So know what's good for you, and then know what you can just ignore, if that makes sense, because you're going to get a lot of rubbish on the way, and you get a lot of dinosaurs in football that will just tell you nonsense. So I think you've got to filter out the bad stuff and then know what works for you, I would say.
Okay. Final thing then is more maybe about TV and that kind of world. How impressive now is it in the modern world to see people like Alex Scott, Farrah Williams, Jill Scott, female footballers of the past now, front and centre on our TV screens on a regular basis. And then I suppose having people like Ian Wright who've empowered the women's game for so long. As a woman working in football, how important is it to see those role models on TV, but then also have people from the men's game stepping up and saying, actually, no, this needs to be taken notice of?
I think for me, it's like massively refreshing because I come from a generation of not seeing it. I didn't grow up watching women's football on TV. That wasn't a thing. So now I'm going to appreciate it probably way more than the younger generation, which is good for them actually. They'll just be used to it. The ones that are watching the Euros now and they're like 10 years old, let's say, they're only ever going to know watching women and men like play football on TV.
And watching us win trophies.
And right now, like England women have won more than the men's,
in
terms of like in the last like few years. It's great to see the women's team are arguably more successful at the moment than the men's. I think it's great, and it is good that I'll appreciate it, but they'll just be used to it. And I've always had this opinion, whether it's unpopular, but I've never agreed with this like women over there, men over there. It would defeat what I'm actually trying to do, because I do want to go like into the men's game. I want to be able to. Right now, I'm literally like floating between the two. So personally, I actually need male allies. I can't be against them because there aren't any women that are going to help me get into the men's game at the moment. So I actually need like to have an allyship like with men in the men's game. So for example, like seeing the overlap, let's say, like Jill Scott's there with Jamie Carragher, with Ian Wright, with Gary Neville. I think that's great that she gets to sit in the room and have the conversation as if she's one of them. And in all fairness, she's achieved just as much. So why wouldn't she have the opportunity to sit on a programme like that and talk football? So I think it's important. I think it's good. And it's good that the younger ones will be used to it, especially for the boys, that they'll also be used to like seeing women play football, and it's not going to be like weird now there's a girl in the playground playing football like what I would be used to, basically. So it's important.
Perfect. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great.